Jenny taught English at Ashford up until 2010 and was also involved with the library as well. I know that many of our attendees will have very fond memories of her lessons, of her English lessons. On retiring in 2010, Jenny qualified as a London Blue Badge Guide and as a City of Canterbury Guide. Her specialist interests include Shakespeare and the literature of war, and she has been obsessed with the history and culture of London ever since childhood. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Jenny, who is going to treat us to a talk on medieval pilgrimages, the journey along the Old Dover Road. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. Well, welcome to this talk, and I'm going to admit I am absolutely shaking in my shoes here. I didn't expect such a large audience, but I'm very pleased about it as well. Now, my subject this evening is going to be pilgrimage and the Old Dover Road, and I will be dealing with the stretch really between London and Canterbury, and that was the part of the road that was used by pilgrims going to the great shrine of St. Thomas Becket. And today it's quite difficult for us to understand the concept of pilgrimage. Why did people go on pilgrimage? Well, there could be a variety of reasons. Firstly, if you died and you'd been on pilgrimage, you could be fairly well absolved of your sins and get through purgatory. Secondly, people in medieval England used to have saints which they really liked, and the most popular saints were those who were associated with healing, like Thomas Becket. The third reason for going on pilgrimage was one that I can understand, because it was a way of seeing the world. You could go all over England visiting shrines, and in Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, the wife of Bath has actually visited Jerusalem 3 times. How's that for considering the time that it was written? Quite amazing. There could have been other reasons for going on pilgrimage. One, you might wish to be getting rid of your husband for a while, or women or men might wish to get rid of their wives. You might go on pilgrimage to find a new husband. Who knows? But my first slide comes from the precincts of Canterbury Cathedral, and it shows pilgrims coming to Canterbury. I must admit that the Old Dover Road was never such a windy route as I see before me, but the pilgrimages would generally begin in spring when the weather was better, and you can see that the trees are coming into blossom, the flowers are coming out, and down at the bottom of the screen you can see geese and ducks with their young. And Chaucer actually tells us that in spring, from every shire's end, the pilgrims came to Canterbury. So let's see more of the route. It is a pictorial presentation, so let's go on. Right, the man who has given us a lot of information about the Old Dover Road is Geoffrey Chaucer, the author of the Canterbury Tales. And he obviously knew the road very well. Chaucer was born in London in 1340, and he was the son of a wine merchant in the Vintry, where Vintners Hall is now situated. But as well as being a London boy, Chaucer, when he was probably about 20 years old, he actually went with King Edward III's armies into France. And he doesn't seem to have been a very good soldier, because he was captured by the French very quickly and then had to be ransomed. And the person who ransomed him was none other than King Edward III himself. So it shows that Chaucer had royal connections. In his later life, as well as writing Troilus and Chryside and the Canterbury Tales, the Book of the Duchess, Chaucer became a customs official. And then he was clerk of the King's Works, which meant that he dealt with public buildings. And probably most importantly, in regard to the old Dover Road, Chaucer was an MP for Kent. There are some academics who say that Chaucer never went to Canterbury, that he didn't know the old Dover Road. And quite honestly, I think that's a load of old rubbish, because he gives us quite a lot of details about it. And we know that in 1376, Chaucer went to Canterbury to attend the Black Prince's funeral. Now here is the Black Prince on his tomb in Canterbury Cathedral. In life, the Black Prince was the poster boy of the English monarchy. He was handsome, he was one hell of a fighter, he was chivalric, he was loyal, and he married for love. And Chaucer appears to have known him well. Perhaps he was a page to the prince. Now, the Black Prince was real hero stuff. When he was 16 years old, he marched his troops down the old Dover Road, crossed to France, 16 years old, and absolutely smashed the French at the Battle of Crecy. And Shakespeare refers to that victory when he describes in Henry V the young prince weltering in blood of French nobility. 10 years later, in 1356, he does it again at the Battle of Poitiers, and this time he manages to capture the French king and bring him back to England. Now, the Black Prince died young. He was in his 40s. We don't know what he died of. He might have died of a wasting disease. It has been suggested that he had syphilis, which was one of the scourges of English troops, particularly if they were serving abroad, or he might have had leprosy. We don't know, but we do know that he knew Chaucer well. And here is the Black Prince in his days of glory, defeating the French. I risked life and limb to take this photograph. I had to balance on a chair in the Huguenot chapel in Canterbury Cathedral. And here you see Edward the Black Prince absolutely beating hell out of a French prisoner. And the Black Prince was devoted to St. Thomas Becket, and when he died, he wished to be buried very close to him in Canterbury Cathedral. And this is one of the ceiling bosses in his Chantry chapel. So there he is. Now, if you went on pilgrimage to Canterbury, your pilgrimages would begin here at Old St. Paul's Cathedral. And if there was a building in medieval London that I would have liked to have seen, this was it. You see it there with its great spire, which was struck by lightning in 1561. And of course, the whole cathedral was burnt down in the Great Fire of London in 1666. But today, if you go into the crypt, into the OBE chapel, you will see in the ceiling a large golden scallop shell, the symbol of pilgrimage, and it's a sign that this was where the pilgrimages would begin. Now, the pilgrims, after they left the cathedral, they go down Cheapside, where they would doff their hats at the house where Thomas Becket had been born. Becket was a feisty Londoner, and he was held in great reverence by Londoners. And then the pilgrims would cross the River Thames. Now, this isn't a particularly good view of Old London Bridge. It looks a bit bashed about in this portrait painting. And London Bridge, Old London Bridge, was one of the glories of the medieval world. It had houses on it, the chapel of St. Thomas Becket, the 36-seater public toilet, and as the pilgrims went over the bridge, as they reached the Southwark side, they would have looked up and they would have seen the heads of executed criminals, which were being pecked at by red kites and crows, a reminder that life and death were very close together in medieval England. So there we've got Pilgrims on the Road to Canterbury, and this is from the miracle windows in Canterbury Cathedral. You can see possibly a knightly figure at the head of the procession on his white horse. Some pilgrims would ride to Canterbury. Many of them would walk, and you can see in this representation one of the walkers, one of the pilgrims, with a very stout stick, and by God, he would have needed it by the time he got to Canterbury. So when the pilgrims got to Southwark, they would say a few prayers in the church of St. Mary over Ree, St. Mary over the river, which is now known as Southwark Cathedral, one of my favourite cathedrals. And you see in the photograph the church as it is today and the glass shard. But also in Southwark Cathedral, there is a window called the Chaucer window, and the photograph is not very good of it at all. And you will see in the window pilgrims going down the road to Canterbury. Now in Southwark, the pilgrims would have met their host. You would need a host who would guide you to Canterbury and look after you. And this host actually existed. His name was Harry Bailey, and he was a great friend of Chaucer. As well as being one of the most prosperous innkeepers in London, he was also an MP. And you see him here welcoming the pilgrims who are going to stay at his inn for one night with a very large flagon of wine. So when the pilgrims were in Southwark, they stayed at the Tabard Inn. The Tabard Inn, sorry, I'm going to have a drink of water. The Tabard Inn no longer exists. It was burnt down in the Great Fire of Southwark in 1676, but it would have been a galleried inn, rather like the George Inn, which is in Southwark still. And the pilgrims would have stayed there for one night, where they would have been liberally entertained by the host. He would given them so much wine, they probably were legless by the time they got to bed. And the food would have been good, and it would have set them up for their journey to Canterbury. And on the building, which is now on the site of the Tabard, there is, of course, one of the famous London blue plaques, which mentions Chaucer and also the Tabard Inn, the site from which Chaucer's pilgrims set off in April 1386. Now, if you were going on pilgrimage, you'd like your souvenirs. The medieval pilgrims were no different to us today. And one of the most popular souvenirs that they could buy were pilgrims' badges. And the gentleman on the horse is, in fact, Thomas Becket. These pilgrims' badges were made of a very fine tin called latten or latoon, and they were actually made in Dartford. But the pilgrims would wear them on their hats. It was a sign, I've been to Thomas Becket's tomb in Canterbury. But they were easily lost. And in any excavations in London, pilgrims' badges come up by the ton, particularly on the Thames foreshore, and many of them are found in Canterbury. And they're very interesting to look at. But everyone seems to have gone on pilgrimage in medieval England, including the royal family, who often went down to Canterbury, down the old Dover Road, and also to Walsingham in Norfolk. So here is the pilgrim's route, and you can see it starting in London. 60 miles. It would take you 4 days to get down the old Dover Road. After the pilgrims left the Tabard, probably feeling a bit hungover, their first stop would be St Thomas of Watering, which was a stream in the old Kent Road, which was dedicated to St Thomas. And they'd water their horses there and have a drink themselves. But right next door to the holy stream at St Thomas of Watering were the gallows. So again, a reminder of life and death. The pilgrims would have gone through Deptford, Greenwich, Blackheath. They would have had a look at Beckenham, where they would have found the oldest mulberry tree in England, and it's still there. And then they would have made their way to Canterbury. Now, the routes were varied. Some of the Pilgrims Way routes are Neolithic trackways, the one that I've marked Pilgrims Way. And particularly if you were coming up from Winchester to Canterbury, you'd take these Neolithic trackways. And it was said that there were so many routes going to Canterbury from all over southern England that it was a bit like a spider's web with Canterbury as its centre. But many of the pilgrims went down what is now Watling Street, the old Roman road, the A2, because it was easier and it was safer. But there was always a problem of lawlessness when the pilgrims were around. And King Edward I in 1285 ordered that all the foliage beside the royal road to Canterbury should be cut back to stop footpads attacking pilgrims and the army. And you can still see between Canterbury and Faversham where the foliage is still cut back to this day. Now, pilgrimage was dangerous. The average size of a pilgrim's group would be 29 to 35. There was safety in numbers. And all along the road, pilgrims were at the mercy of thieves and robbers. And these thieves and robbers all had their own language. It was a bit like Cockney rhyming slang, which was set up to fool the police in 18th century London. Well, the same thing happened on the roads to Canterbury. The thieves were called rufflers, and they would jump out on the pilgrims and hopefully manage to steal a few bob. And you also had creatures called glimmerers. Now, the glimmerers were the prostitutes, which were, there were very heavy numbers of prostitutes on the old Dover Road, and they glimmer out of the foliage and then glimmer back in, no doubt, with a few pilgrims in tow. So the pilgrims had to be very careful. And that's why you had someone like the host who was a big man. And in the Miller's Tale, you wouldn't have messed with the miller if you were a thief, because he was able to break down doors with his head, and he was a champion wrestler. And you also need someone like the knight who could really look after the pilgrims on the way. But I have to say at this point, that the pilgrims were no angels at all. They were very, very well behaved. Oh, no, they were very, very badly behaved. They would sing filthy songs. They'd encourage lechery with each other. And someone like the miller would play the bagpipe all the way down to Canterbury. It must have been hell upon earth. And all the pilgrims would be accompanied by crowds of stray dogs. And there were many complaints about the bad behaviour of the pilgrims, which I must admit did come as a surprise to me. Now, some pilgrims, if they were coming from Essex, decided that they didn't want to go all the way up to the City of London and cross by London Bridge, that they would take what was called the short ferry from Tilbury to Gravesend. And if you go into the market halls in Gravesend, you can see murals of pilgrims crossing the River Thames, rather queasy-looking creatures helping to row the boat. But this was an extremely dangerous way of getting to the pilgrim routes, because often the pilgrim boats would capsize. And if that happened to you, you were a goner, because out in the centre of the River Thames, the water's about 30 to 40 feet deep. So if you fall into it, no chance at all. If you survived your Thames crossing, you would end up here at Milton Chantry, the oldest building in Gravesend, which was founded in 1240, and the pilgrims would stay there for the night. There was nothing free on pilgrimage, nothing free at all. You would have to pay for everything, and you would have to pay ecclesiastical establishments a good rate to stay there for the night. Some of the pilgrims would then make their way up to the little village of Cobham, which is a lovely village, and they would stay in Cobham College, which was a college of priests which had been founded by a friend of the Black Pyince. And also, when they were in Cobham, they might stay at Ye Old Leather Bottle, which is still there, not obviously the same buildings. It's still there, and it's still a very good pub. They'd make their way then to Rochester. And there were so many pilgrims descending on Rochester en route to Canterbury that Rochester Bridge kept falling down and had to be rebuilt very quickly. And some of the pilgrims would obviously have crossed by boat. But they liked Rochester, the pilgrims. It was a place where they could find good hostelries, they could buy their souvenirs. But Rochester Cathedral was also a rival to Canterbury Cathedral because it had its own saint who people would visit on pilgrimage. The saint at Rochester Cathedral was a very poor soul. He was a baker called William of Perth, who'd come all the way down to Scotland to go to Thomas Becket's shrine, and he brought with him an orphaned boy who he had adopted. Now, the orphan boy was not everything he seemed, and the orphan, called David, led William of Perth to a very unpleasant area of Rochester called the Dells. It's still unpleasant today. And there, the orphan murdered the very gullible William and left his body in a ditch to rot. But his body was found and brought back to Rochester Cathedral, and immediately William of Perth was able to do miracles. He was particularly good at healing those with mental health issues. But what really tickles me about William of Perth was that the poor soul was murdered by an orphan that he'd been good to. And what does the church do? They make him the patron saint of of orphans. Now that to me is a real double whammy. You're murdered by an orphan and then you're made the patron saint of them. So I think there was rather a lack of logic in the medieval mind at times. And if you go into Rochester Cathedral today, you can still see the steps which the pilgrims went up, and they're very badly worn. So after Rochester, they went through Gillingham, after another drink, Rainham, Sittingbourne, and then they would get to Faversham. Now I thought I'd lost my PowerPoint. Moment of panic over. Right, their next stop would be the Maison Dieu, the House of God in Ospringe, in Faversham. And there the pilgrims would give themselves a good wash before they made their descent into Canterbury. And there was a holy stream that used to flow through the building. But at the Maison Dieu in Faversham, this was also a very important stopping place on the royal route, the route from France to London. And in 1422, when King Henry V had died of dysentery in France, his body had to be taken back to Westminster Abbey for a state funeral. How do you manage that? The king would well and truly rotted by the time they got him to London. And the way that the authorities dealt with it was that they boiled Henry V's body until all the flesh disappeared from the bones. So this was the way that if you died in France and you were well off, this was what would happen to you. And in fact, the body of Henry V, by the time it got to Westminster Abbey, was simply a skeleton. Rather nasty details here. I could have gone in far greater detail, but I'm not going to. So, on the journey to Canterbury, they'd go past Bolton and they'd come to Harbledown. And I walk to Harbledown regularly, and you can see the village sign, and it's got a pilgrim on horseback, which unfortunately, from my vantage point, looks more like a Komodo dragon. But Harbledown was known in the Canterbury Tales as Bob Up and Down. It's called that in the Mansiple's Tale. And you get the impression that the road surface was a bit rough and probably hard on back sides, which had been in the saddle for too long. But when they were at Harbledown, the pilgrims would have a drink at the Black Pyince's well. They'd go and visit the leper hospital of St. Nicholas that you can see in my photographs. And there they would be in for a treat, because each of the pilgrims would queue up outside a small window, and they would pay a certain amount of money to see one of the relics of St. Thomas Becket. The window would be pulled open, a miserable old devil would appear, take the money, and he would thrust out in the pilgrim's face a shoe which was supposed to have belonged to Thomas Becket. It had been there for about 200 years, but they would be told to kiss the shoe, and then it would be whipped back in quickly until the next pilgrim came along. In fact, there is a relic in Canterbury still today which is associated with Becket, and that is in St. Thomas's Catholic Church, where there is supposed to be a finger of Becket. Well, all I can say is that Becket must have had loads of fingers, because there are bits of him all over Europe, if you believe that. But at Harbledown, there was also an important link with the story of Becket, because when King Henry II did penance in 1171, he got off his horse at Harbledown, stripped himself to his breeches and a cloak, and walked down into Canterbury, where he was whipped by monks in front of Becket's tomb in the cathedral. So the pilgrims are getting a bit excited now. They are approaching Canterbury, and as they went down Summer Hill, they would see in the distance Canterbury Cathedral, which was known as the Vision Splendid. More about that in a minute. The pilgrims, as they went into Canterbury, would also have a quick look in St Dunstan's church, and Henry II did penance there as well. And then they'd go down St Dunstan Street, not far from where I live, until they came to the Westgate Towers. And the Westgate Towers, which are most magnificently decorated at the moment with fairy lights, they were built in 1380, 1381 against the French. And if you look at my photograph, you will see what looks like large keyholes in the masonry. And they are gun loops, because this was where gunpowder was used for the first time in English history. And it was through the forerunner of this gate that the Black Prince's funeral passed in 1376, complete with Geoffrey Chaucer as well. Now they'd make their way up St Peter's Street or the High Street, and they would pass, well, they wouldn't have passed this statue, but if you go up the High Street now, you will see the new statue dedicated to Geoffrey Chaucer. And at the base of the statue, there are the pilgrims visiting Canterbury. And the squire is said to be the living image of the actor Orlando Bloom, who paid for his face to be on the statue. Right, the pilgrims wouldn't have seen that, but you can still see the statue today. But one building the pilgrims would have seen is this one, the Eastbridge Hospital in Canterbury. And poorer pilgrims would have stayed in the crypt. And you can go into the crypt today. It's fairly damp, and you're aware that you're very close to the River Stour. But this was the place where female pilgrims, if they were expecting a child, were encouraged to stay. And there were many pilgrims' babies born at the Eastbridge Hospital. It's well worth a visit. When COVID is over, if you get a chance, go in and have a look round. The Eastbridge Hospital was in fact founded by Thomas Becket's sister in memory of him. So they go along the High Street, and then they would get to Mercery Lane, where the poor pilgrims were, well, they really experienced a con job in Mercery Lane, because they were all encouraged to buy little bottles of red water, orangey red water, which was said to be Becket's blood. Well, all I can say, it lasted a hell of a while, but it wasn't Becket's blood at all. It was, in fact, orange water from the local well. And in Mercery Lane, they would also have seen these two lovely boys, the two Grotesques. There are lots of these in Canterbury, and these Grotesques have been, I must admit, had a bit of restoration on them. They were put on the building that is now Pret-a-Manger to deter evil spirits from entering the house. And it's said that they were put there in 1348, the year of the Black Death, another horrendous pandemic. And Chaucer was about 8 years old when the Black Death struck, and he managed to survive it. But these two fellas are very frequently photographed by visitors to Canterbury. When they got to the Buttermarket in front of the cathedral, the pilgrims, whether it was from 1170 onwards and until 1538, they would have been encouraged to stay at one of the many Pilgrims Inns around the Buttermarket. There were loads of them, but there were loads of pilgrims as well, and accommodation must have been a problem. The large creamy white building behind the War Memorial was one of the largest Pilgrims Inns, and if you were rich, you stayed down the bottom where the air was better and there was a garden. But if you were poor, you were up the top and you just had to get on with it. So another place they stayed, which people who know King's School might recognise, this is the Aula Nova and the Norman staircase. And the hall above the arches was used by poorer pilgrims. Now this was what the pilgrims were after. It didn't look like this, really, until about 1500. And when the pilgrims visited Canterbury, they wouldn't have had the Bell-Harry Tower. They would have had the Angel Steeple, and one of the Western Towers would have been completely different. But this was their goal, because they were at the shrine of Thomas Becket. There you have Thomas Becket being done to death. He's being attacked by the four knights. They're just about to take off the top of his skull, and the rather pallid creature holding the cross aloft was his young acolyte, and I can't remember whether he was Wilfrid or William, but suffice to say he was protecting the Archbishop, and for that he lost his hand. And when I was in Bayeux Cathedral a couple of years ago, there is an absolute horrendous version of the murder of Becket, where the poor acolyte's hand is just hanging by a thread. But after Becket's murder, the night of the 29th of December 1170, local people went into the cathedral and they dipped their handkerchiefs in Becket's blood and brains. And it is said that immediately, if they were ill or sick in any way, that they were immediately cured. But that is the basis for the pilgrimages from all over Europe, really, in honour of Thomas Becket. And here is the altar of the sword point, not where Becket was murdered, but fairly close to it, but you can see the name Thomas in the flagstone. Becket killed by four knights, as you will all know, four knights of Henry II. Now the pilgrims, when they came to Canterbury Cathedral, their aim was the shrine, and some of them were in a very bad way physically, and they'd often have the medieval equivalent of Zimmer frames and crutches, and they would crawl up these steps to Becket's shrine, and the steps, as in Rochester, are very worn indeed. And some pilgrims would get very close to the saint for his blessing, hoping he'd make them better, and they would actually crawl into the niches beside the tomb. And every so often, the top of Becket's tomb would be raised, the top of the shrine would be raised, and the saint's body would be revealed. As I've said to you earlier, nothing came free on pilgrimage. They would have to pay for it. And the pilgrimages went on until 1538, when King Henry VIII in the Reformation broke up Becket's shrine and took all the jewels to London, including the Regale de France, the great ruby, which had been given to Becket's shrine by the French king. And no one knows where Becket's body is. He's supposed to be somewhere around, and it's always thought that when there's an archaeological excavation in the cathedral precincts, that they are hoping that Becket will come to light. He hasn't yet. But the old Dover Road and the pilgrimage routes didn't end at Canterbury. They go on to Dover. But on the last leg of the English route, they would go across Barham Downs, still outside Canterbury. And there pilgrims going to Europe would often meet up with pilgrims coming from France. And the pilgrims who came from France would often bring their packed lunches with them. And in these packed lunches, there would be snails. Londoners have difficulty with that word. They say snails. There would be edible snails brought over by the French and discarded on Barham Downs. And on Barham Downs, you can today find snails which had their origins in France. They are still there. So they go down to Dover. They might stay in the building of St Martin le Grand, which is now part of Dover College. You can see it at the bottom. And then they would take ship to France. And pilgrimage still carries on today. It's become very fashionable to be interested in pilgrimage, and Blue Badge guides often have charity walks all the way down the old Dover Road from London to Canterbury. I haven't tried it yet. Personally, I think I'm a bit old for it now, so I will not be undertaking it. But there are still pilgrims who come to Canterbury, and you see them walking through the high street in Canterbury with their staffs and their big thick boots, because they are on their way to Rome, and still it's still a thriving business. So there you go. That is the very potted history of the old Dover Road. And I could really have said far more, but I can imagine that some of you are probably sort of nodding off already. So had I added more, I think it might have been too much. It would certainly have been too much from me, because I would rather be out on the streets guiding. I'm not good with virtual tours, but I do hope that I've taught you something today. The teacher's instincts never die. So if there are any questions, I'll take them now, if I may, and Hannah's going to see to that for me.
Yep, I've got my mic on, I'm ready. So if anyone has any questions, you can pop them in the chat, or turn your mic on and ask away.
I've got a question. How did the pilgrims all get together in the first place? There can't have been an email going round or anything. How did they get together?
It's interesting that you'd ask this, because it was something that I was thinking of today. My husband actually asked me, and I said, oh, bloody hell, I don't know. But I think that there wouldn't have been any of the technology that we have today. We can only imagine that messages would have been sent out to churches all over England and encouraging people to go on pilgrimage. And it might be that there were people like me, people who like tourist guides who encouraged pilgrimage, but I'm sure that it was probably done within the church itself, in sermons. Now there's going to be another pilgrimage to Canterbury at so and so time. That's the only way that I think they could have done it. I might be wrong, but I will check up on it and I'll let Hannah know.
We've got a question from Alex Osborne, who was Rogers at school.
Oh, yeah. Hello.
She said, was there a lessening of visitors following the English Reformation and the destroying of Becket's tomb, or did the pilgrims keep coming regardless?
Oh no, there was definitely a real drop-off after Becket's shrine was broken up, and Canterbury went into an economic decline, and the economic decline was only rectified by the Huguenot and Walloon weavers who came over from Flanders and brought prosperity back to Canterbury. Otherwise, Canterbury was in a bit of a hell of a state. So it did really destroy the economy. when the shrine disappeared.
And we've got a question from Karen, who said the shell symbol, she's seen it before in France. Is it part of the pilgrimages too?
Say that again, Hannah.
The shell symbol,
Yeah.
she's seen it before in France. Is it a part of the pilgrimages too?
Yes, it is. And the shells were often carried by pilgrims, and they would be used as food bowls. You know, the large conch, well, not conch shells. I'm thinking of Lord of the Rings there, but not Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Flies. And the conch shells would be used for food. Yes, the scallop shells were particularly associated with the Shrine of St. James in Compostela, and they did become the universal symbol of pilgrimage. In fact, I did forget to say that Thomas Becket was a real European saint. Though I found a church to him once in Salamanca in Spain, and there's also one right up near the Arctic Circle in northern Norway. So his influence spread far and wide around Europe.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Gina Lachlan-Sims has said there are other Maison Dieu in Kent. Would they have all been for pilgrimages and pilgrims?
No, Gina, not necessarily. Some of them were used for civic duties, like the one in Dover, but they would definitely have been, a lot of them would have been used as pilgrimage centres because they had to stay somewhere. The best Maison Dieu is in Dover. And I can see a message here, the Archbishop's Palace in Charing, and that was another place where they would stay.
Great. Are there any more questions to come in? Feel free to put your mic on and ask as well.
No? I haven't really got a question, but it's just a comment that I live in the north of England, near Durham, where Lindisfarne, Holy Island up there. And it's amazing that, even in the sort of 600s, they were doing pilgrimages to Rome.
Yes.
From right up the north. It's just amazing, isn't it, how they managed it?
Yes, they did. The organisation must have been phenomenal. It must have been an absolutely flourishing trade, because how could you have organised everyone? So I agree with that. It was tourism on a very large scale.
And it's amazing to think as well how many people monopolised it for their own good as well, in that sense too.
Yeah. Yes. So.
Well, it's definitely made me want to when we can anyway, have a bit of a wander around Kent again and go to Faversham and go to Canterbury and Rochester. So thank you very much for giving up your time, Jenny. I really enjoyed the talk, and I think I can see from the comments that everyone else did as well. So thank you everyone for coming. If you think of a question afterwards, do let me know. Just drop me an email and I can put you in touch with Jenny. I'm sure that's fine with her. So thank you everyone for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone.
Before I go, Hannah,
yes,
I feel bloody exhausted now, I must admit. I really do. But I had mentioned to Hannah in the future, when this pandemic is over, about doing proper tours in London, in Gravesend and Canterbury, so I'm up for it. So watch this space. I'll wear you out, but you should enjoy yourself.
Yeah, I think it would be really lovely to organise an ASA tour in Canterbury or in London with you. I think that would be absolutely fantastic. Yeah. I have actually, before we go, just spotted one more question that's come in, which is from Annette, and she said, do we know anything about the various characters in the Canterbury Tales, like Harry Bailey, or were they entirely fictional?
No, Harry Bailey was definitely not fictional, because he actually existed. He was an MP, so we know he existed, and he was Chaucer's friend. But as to the veracity of the characterization in the Canterbury Tales, I always like to think that Chaucer had seen people like his creations on the pilgrim's route. And I don't know whether anyone else, particularly my old English comrades, and colleagues, whether they feel the same, that Chaucer's characters are constructs, but I'm sure he must have met a hell of a lot of people like the pilgrims that he describes.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jenny. Thank you everyone for coming. And as I said before, any further questions, just drop me an email and I will forward them on. But enjoy the rest of your evenings, everyone. And thank you again.